Welcome to HCD's Mindset. I'm Michelle Nigella.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose.
We are on a mission to help you identify what consumer science innovations have a lot of untapped value or are too good to be true.
So join us for more curious conversations as we try to make sense of the complex but fascinating world of human behavior. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mindset. We're back with your favorite co-hosts, Michelle Nigella, and myself, Kathryn Ambrose. And we are very excited to have a wonderful guest with us, Michael Smith. He is the author of this new book, Inspiring Green Consumer Choices, Leveraging Neuroscience to Reshape Marketplace Behavior. And we are really just excited to dive into a conversation with him about all his experiences in the neuromarketing world and about this book. But we just want to welcome you to the show, Michael.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. So can you share a little bit about who you are and how you really got to this place? What's your origin story?
Well, do you want the short version or the long version?
Whichever one you want to go with.
Well, just very briefly, I'm a neuroscientist with a few decades of experience at this point in research on human behavior, with the sort of growing fascination about the drivers of consumer behavior. Just personally, I've worked in a variety of settings, government, academic, commercial settings. And I lived in Southern California with a professorial wife and a teenage son and way too many pets. How I landed here is the more complicated part. I always wanted to be some type of experimental psychologist, and over time that trended towards being a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist. I originally started working in a typical academic track as a young scholar, but at an early stage switched over to working in the commercial world, with a heavy focus on neurophysiological concomitants of human factors engineering.
Interesting. So when you were doing the academic track, you were mentioning like cognition, right? In neuroscience. Also on the academic side, what drew you to that? Because like not everybody even understands what neuroscience is. And I know when I started out in neuroscience, it was still in the psychology department and it didn't necessarily have its own department. It was in psychobiology was my PhD. So like for you, what drew you to neuroscience?
It was kind of happenstance, actually. And when I was a graduate student, it was the same sort of thing. I was actually in a cognitive psychology program, and my focus was on human memory at the time. And it was unusual for cognitive psychologists to delve into the realm of cognitive neuroscience. But an opportunity arose for me to work with someone from the UCLA Brain Research Institute who had this research program studying the neurophysiology of the brain in epilepsy patients who had depth electrodes implanted in them to study their seizures. Yeah. And many of these depth electrodes ended up in the medial temporal lobe and areas such as the hippocampus that are critical for memory. So since I was already focused on memory research, I kind of switched gears and focused on the neurophysiology of memory. And while these patients were sitting around waiting to have seizures, I would test them with memory paradigms, evaluate changes in hippocampal activity as a function of their time on learning.
When you say ended up in the hippocampal area,
well, that's what we're targeting.
So it was on purpose.
Yeah, because for medial temporal lobe epilepsy, much of it originates in the hippocampus and related structures. And because they're kind of deep down in the brain, just by doing surface electroencephalography, you can't really identify necessarily where the seizures are coming from.
Yeah.
And if they can identify one or the other side of the brain that's the predominant source of seizures, they could go in and do surgical interventions in ways that still preserved hippocampal function in these patients. So it was a definitively targeted decision to put electrodes in the hippocampus.
So is there anything particular about memory that really attracted you or interested you?
Well, I think the first thing that attracted me to it was, as an undergraduate, I got a good grade in my learning memory class. And so that reinforced the notion that maybe I could make some progress in that area. But it was also just, I wanted to understand better how people build mental models of the external environment and how those mental models guide behavior. And the study of memory formation, memory retrieval is very intrinsic to that. Another thing about it that always fascinated me, and it's more closely related to the realm of consumer neuroscience, is the way that memory breaks down in amnesia. So, for example, there's a lot of evidence in patients with amnesia that they can still display other forms of learning, either through the habit system or in terms of some emotional responses they might come to associate with a stimulus in ways that they're not even conscious of. Mm-hmm. And that relates fairly closely to the field of consumer neuroscience, because quite often, people are making decisions out there in the marketplace based on their habit system rather than, more rational considerations about what they might be doing. And, as we know from the field of consumer neuroscience, people often have implicit emotional reactions to things that color the way that they think about the world in ways that they may not be fully aware of. So that aspect was also just intrinsically fascinating.
I totally agree.
That transition from academia to industry, it's a tough one for some people. I know we talk about this a lot, that in academia, industry is a dirty word, right? Yeah. As soon as you see that a study is like sponsored by a company, everybody's like, oh, no. But, having worked in industry now, I recognize like all the effort that has to go in when you're doing industry sponsored research. Like there's a lot of hurdles, right? So maybe it's even more cautious than some academic research in some ways. So what was that transition like for you? How did you end up in industry when you were on this academic route?
It actually was strangely smooth. So when I first moved into industry, I was recruited into a startup technology company. And this was before fMRI was a deal, the very early 90s, before the fMRI kind of took over the field of cognitive neuroscience. And I had the opportunity to work on developing new technology that was focused on the rollout of high density EEG recordings and the integration of EEG inverse models with structural MRI methods, and to help develop and apply a new technology, a new era of that technology. So it was kind of directly in line with my prior background in doing electrophysiology. And in that domain, we also ended up with a lot of government funding to explore things that were intrinsically interesting. And this is through grant methods, so it behooved us to continue to publish results on interesting topics. And the research in that context was driven in large part by the demands of operators of complex equipment in the US military. So we were funded by the DoD to look at things like cognitive workload, and the effects of stressors like sleep loss, and on issues related to learning and memory. because this actually leads kind of directly to my transition into consumer neuroscience, inadvertently. So we were funded by the US Air Force, I believe, at this point, to look at ways to monitor brain changes while people learn new information, because they spend a lot of time training operators of complex systems to operate those systems effectively. And so they wanted to know, is it possible to monitor changes in their brains while they're working on these complex systems? They were also interested in looking at explicit training materials and ways to optimize training. And at the time, they were using a lot of video materials to train their personnel. So we did work on looking at, again, this development of mental models as people learn new systems and how that was reflected in changes in the EEG. But we also needed to figure out, how do you monitor engagement with video-based training materials? And so it occurred to us, what if we needed some short pieces of film so we could look at film that was engaging and not engaging, so we could develop biomarkers of engagement. And just out of the blue, we thought, well, what if we get some really boring ads, like those that come up on late night TV for your local ship?
Like ShamWow.
Yeah, and those that are award-winning, emotionally engaging, intrinsically interesting, or funny, polished ads. Throw them at some people, record their EEG, and see if we can distinguish between those two categories of materials. And it turned out we could, and that was interesting. But we just sat on the data for a while. And then a little bit later in time, I ended up going back to school to get a business degree, and I was in an advertising research class. And I had to do a project for the semester. So we went back and I took on that project and reanalyzed the data and wrote it up and ended up publishing it. And so I had this early stage paper about using EEG to assess advertising effectiveness without ever wanting to do that explicitly.
So what drew you back to going back to school for a business degree after you had already been kind of getting your feet wet a little bit actually in the industry after coming?
It seems
from
almost
academia?
like R&D a bit, really, that you were doing, with
Well,
the
I was,
military
but,
contracts.
for many people in engineering backgrounds or scientific backgrounds, to advance in some of these business settings means you need to understand a little bit about business. And I was working at a startup trying to grow the business. So that was what drove me to go back to school to get a business degree. The setting that I was in really required someone to have some business savvy in order to grow the business.
Absolutely. And so you've really seen from almost, I don't want to say the inception, but for a time to watch how neuromarketing has evolved over time. And when was the first time you actually heard that term? Was it when you were at that startup, or was it a little bit later on?
No, it was later on, definitely. In fact, when I first, back in the 90s, there was a lot of talk about the emerging attention economy. And back then, there was even some other little startups focused explicitly on using physiological methods to evaluate marketing materials of one firm or another. But the term neuromarketing per se didn't really occur till some years later. And I had already moved on from that prior setting to another job at that point. But then I ran into an old colleague at a conference some years later. And he told me, well, there's this opportunity in another new startup that I think you'd be perfect for, and we should talk. And I said, okay, I had a job already, but then we subsequently had a conversation, and that conversation revolved around recruiting me into an early stage neuromarketing company as the first actual neuroscientist on board,
Mm.
part in the founding team. And that was where I became familiarized with the term neuromarketing, but we weren't really throwing it out around much then. And one thing led to another, and here I am today, having spent the last 15 years about working in the neuromarketing or consumer neuroscience space.
And how have you seen the industry change since you've been a part of this industry?
Many ways. It used to be very small with very few players who were fairly nasty to each other when they were fighting for the same clients. So there are a lot less collegiality, a lot of inflated claims, and really a lack of serious validation and demonstrations of reliability of methods and demonstrations of the value of using neuroscience methods to evaluate marketing materials or to optimize creative strategies. And that's changed completely at this point in time.
You think completely?
Well, I think it's changed a lot at this point. Also, on the client side, there was a whole lot of skepticism. And I think at this point, essentially all of the big brand marketers have used these tools to some degree. Many have gotten very comfortable with them,
Right.
and some are using them as replacements for their traditional assessment methods, or at least as routine complements. So that's changed. I think the vendors themselves have gotten a lot more mature. There's a lot less craziness out there than there used to be. I think there's a lot more collaboration between vendors and warmer partnerships between the vendors and the clients themselves, which have emerged over time. And I think that's all positive, but over the last few years, the industry has suffered some setbacks because of the COVID shutdown and how things will shake up going forward.
You have to be in person to put gear on someone's head.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that has some implications for, many people have shifted gears as a result of that. And I think it has some implications for things going forward. I think there'll be increasing emphasis on online tools, especially those that can be where studies can be turned around fast and relatively inexpensively. And as I'm sure you guys have been seeing, there's more emergence of AI-based tools that if you get enough laboratory data, you can certainly train algorithms that make some of the inferences that you might have been able to make with laboratory data. How well those end up working and how rapidly they evolve in sophistication and how effective, how well they're accepted in the marketplace remains to be seen. But I don't think there's any stopping that train at this point.
Right.
Over the coming years, we're just going to see more and more of it.
Now, predominantly your work has really been in that sort of ad space, right? The marketing sort of space.
Sure.
When it comes to neuromarketing or consumer neuroscience. And I kind of feel like that whole field is changing, right? So, the whole industry of making ads and testing ads is met with some real challenges now where people aren't watching live TV anymore, right? And, when you're streaming, in a lot of cases, you're not seeing any ads, so if you're using Netflix, there's no ads.
Right. What's ShamWow going to do?
What is ShamWow going to do?
Netflix may be changing that strategy.
True. But, I think, we talked about, ages ago, like, with YouTube and it's, a couple of seconds of ads that you have to watch before you can see the video. Or maybe going a step back further and thinking about the banner ads that used to be on websites, people learn to ignore. And I think now that everybody has, a device, right? Well, you can't, let me this way. Everybody has a device. As soon as ads come on, you can just see heads go down, right? And now they're, looking through Instagram or Twitter or whatever it might be, instead of watching the ads that have come up on TV. And so this is something that I think the ad industry is really going to have to come to terms with. And a lot of things are moving into a Web3 metaverse kind of situation where brands' main source of communication may not be ads. It may have to be, it might have to be Twitter, or it might have to be Instagram or TikTok, right?
Product placement within the TikTok videos, or
yeah,
on the Netflix films.
Right. What are your thoughts of this evolution?
Well, that's also inevitable, and we see, in fact, the optimization of advertising on these online platforms, which is still there when people look away from the big screen, to be a bigger and bigger component of client demand for doing research on. So I think there's still lots of opportunities for people in the field to thrive without necessarily focusing all their efforts on testing, 30-second
spots. Yeah.
Ads.
But do you think the metrics that were established for ad success, if we think about the traditional ones, it's typically like recall, and what is it, where it's standout of some sort, and when it comes to neuromarketing, it's been more about engagement and things like that. What do you think people are looking for when it's TikTok?
I think engagement is still a big part of it, because the best thing about TikTok is some of the spots are incredibly either amusing or pretty or something. So I think engagement is still there. It's just engagement over much shorter time spans. But, to your point on watching YouTube videos for a few seconds, I think people are much more aware of building in both branding moments and impactful content right from the start, rather than having really slow rolling development of engagement over time. The storylines have to be truncated. And if you can tell a story in 5 seconds, that's a pretty big creative challenge.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think also part of it comes, especially with something like TikTok, is how impactful can that be in the long term? If somebody sees it for 5 seconds and it is engaging them for 5 seconds, will that be something that translates to them seeing it in the store and then remembering that TikTok? And, I think that is a big hurdle for
the associations, the
advertisers.
Cues. Yeah.
It will depend once again on, the folks who do things like market mix modeling and attribution studies for ads to sort that out in the marketplace.
Absolutely. And so pivoting a little bit to the book that you had just written, it is about consumerism. So can you share a little bit about what inspired this book? I know you touched on in previous conversations how you had a little bit of time, so that's why you decided to write this book, or it was a pandemic achievement was writing this story. Can you share a little bit about what it's about?
Sure. And since you're bringing up the book here. So I've always been interested in environmental issues. And as I mentioned, I have a kid and they need a planet to live on. And I was struck by, a lot of people espouse a desire to be more intentional consumers and to lessen their own footprint on the environment. But almost nobody really fully lives up to that dream, even though many of us would like to. And so, as a student of consumer behavior, I wanted to understand better about what we could understand about that intention action gap through the lens of consumer neuroscience. What do we know about how people respond to shopping opportunities, or how people, what satisfaction they want to get out of their products? How does all that knowledge impact our understanding of the intention action gap, and what sort of factors can help us to close that gap? And as you mentioned, I had time on my hands during the pandemic. So I thought good opportunity to take a deep dive into the relevant literature and to try to outline what I learned from that in a way that can be shared relatively succinctly with marketers. And so that's the the intention of the book, not to target consumers per se, but to target brand marketers who are coming under an increased impetus to figure out how to sell more sustainable products to consumers, how to help them to understand what they're doing wrong, what they need to do to get it right, and to help outline a path for them to get there more quickly.
I find that very interesting, especially because one of the best things that we can do for the environment is to just continue to reuse. I think that's the big, like out of reuse, recycle, everything. Like, I think that's one of the strongest ones that often gets overlooked, because rather than fixing something, people will just run out to the store and buy it. And marketers love that because they're going out to buy a product. So it's a very interesting balance that you're trying to strike when dealing with sustainability, because you want your things to be long lasting, but you also want people to continue buying for your organization or your company to actually succeed and gain profits. What are your thoughts on that? I
spent some time, especially on that topic towards the end of the book, and talking about barriers that exist in the marketplace that prevent people from doing exactly that. Repairing their stuff, sharing their stuff, having a long-term emotional attachment to their stuff, so they're not so quick to throw it out. And that was interesting in and of itself to me. So.
Yeah, speaking of tying this into our earlier conversation, speaking of social media, I was on Instagram the other day, and I saw something that this person, their whole thing is about how they're trying to do zero waste. And she said, nobody's thinking about Christmas right now, but if you want a really easy Christmas gift, get vanilla beans and then just put some whiskey in it, and you can give out, like you give vanilla extract for Chris. And I was like, I never even thought to do that. Like, it's very interesting how creative people are getting.
But it's interesting because, this was kind of your pandemic baby, right? And during the pandemic, people's habits changed drastically
Had to.
People kind of, this whole paradigm shift of how people were shopping, where suddenly everything's more online, which is certainly less green, right? While there were fewer cars on the road, the amount of people ordering online and returning online, right? When you don't see all of that, you don't see the waste and the carbon footprint, you can ignore it and feel that you're still doing well. What are your feelings about this sort of change, this shift?
Well, I have mixed feelings about it because, as you know, the cars are back on the road, at least for the most part.
But the shopping online remains.
Well, it is the case that large organizations like Amazon and Walmart and whatnot, they have societal pressure to reduce their own footprint, and including whatever that involves in deliveries and packaging. And they spend a lot of money really focusing on optimizing their operations to reduce their environmental footprint. And they could do that at scale.
Yeah.
And if they chose to, they could also use that scale to help nudge consumers into being more reasonable with their shopping habits. So on the one hand, it is a concern. On the other hand, I think there is a lot of potential for those large organizations to make really big impacts in ways that, us as individuals, we can only make tiny little impacts, and maybe they'll add together. But unless the marketplace changes, people have a hard time changing.
Absolutely. I've actually seen a couple, and who knows what statistics are real or not when you're seeing it just popping up with all the different things that we're consuming. But I have seen a lot of things in the past few months that are really emphasizing and putting a spotlight on big organizations, where if big organizations don't change, like you were saying, what's the difference between you having a plastic straw and a reusable one, when you have a giant like Amazon not making the right app? Or I don't want to give Amazon as an example, but if there's a large organization as a company not making big differences and having a massive carbon footprint, like there's going to still be that massive
drop in the bucket, right?
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
I know they are trying hard. So there's this organization that I speak at every once in a while called Sustainable Brands.
Mm.
And it's a large, they have many meetings every year. And most of the attendees are all representatives of large organizations. The sponsors are all representatives of large organizations. And they're all kind of collectively trying to figure out how to shift the market dynamic in productive ways. And some of it, is whitewashing the whole or greenwashing the whole thing. But some of it, I'm quite sure, is sincere.
Mm-hmm.
These organizations all have large sustainability teams, and those people are working hard to try to make a difference. Now, from my perspective, and my interest in this field, that in and of itself is a market opportunity, because these are directly the people I'd want to communicate with and to help them to optimize their client-facing strategies, or their consumer-facing strategies.
So then what are your thoughts on the idea of, like you said, whitewashing, greenwashing in the industry? Do you think it's really policy that's going to have to take place to try to make changes in it, or is it on the organizations?
I think both. I mean, we already have truth in advertising laws,
Mm-hmm.
and truth in packaging laws. So I think there's already policy there. Whether it's enforced or not, it's a whole nother matter. But I think advertisers themselves are learning that they've kind of shot themselves in the foot in the past over this. And this is also something that I discuss at some length in the book. People are inherently suspicious about any kind of environmentally friendly claims made about products now. It turns them off. And in many cases, if they see that, they automatically have some instinctual, no, I'm not going there. I'll buy your competitor's claim, your competitor's product instead. And that will hurt people down the line.
Yeah.
And so I think there's motivation. We really don't like to be taken advantage of and cheated. Mm-hmm. People have a very basic emotional response to being taken advantage of. And if they feel like advertisers trying to take advantage of them, that comes across. So I think the brands are learning and are getting better about not doing it. There's a long ways to go, undoubtedly, but I think I'm optimistic that.
And I think that's a value that more and more is attempted to be measured in consumer research, that idea of authenticity, whether that's coming across, but it is a very hard thing to measure. If you ask someone if they know whether something's authentic, they can tell you, but defining the word in a consumer way is nearly impossible. And I'm not sure that everybody always understands what the word means. So if you were to just ask it in a scale question, how authentic is this brand? It could be very confusing to a consumer to see something like that. Do you have any ideas about measuring authenticity?
Yeah, and I agree. Authenticity is a complex word in and of itself. So I like to focus more on trust. Do you trust this claim? Do you trust this manufacturer? Because it's simpler and people have a better intuitive understanding about what it means. Where, it could be called a synonym. It's not quite, but it's sort of shorthand for getting at the same topic.
Yeah. Nice.
And do you feel as though the idea of trust is what people have to be focusing on going forward within this field? If they want, say you're a professional that's trying to enter into this space and promote sustainable behaviors, is that what you think the next leg of their marketing strategy should be, is really putting the emphasis more on trust as opposed to anything else that we chatted about, the idea of green?
Well, I think, quite apart from this space, most brand marketers understand that if they want to have long-term brand health, trust has to be a part of that. Mm-hmm. And I think it only becomes more important in this area where people are suspicious about claims to begin with.
Mm. I think that becomes even more important when we think again about the way advertising and branding communications is moving more into the metaverse type realm, where authenticity can really be called into question. So if you are, scrolling through TikTok and you see influencers or you see an ad that clearly says it's sponsored by whatever company, is almost like, again, that immediate, the flags go up, kind of like what I was saying with academics saying that it's industry sponsored research, industry sponsored ad on TikTok, you immediately tune out, right? Or you try to swipe past it. So again, like getting at that authenticity, that trust, that even wanting to participate in something, it seems challenging.
Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely.
I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's going to be a huge challenge.
And I think that is kind of, it's one of the hurdles, the many hurdles that we're going to have to work on within the field of both consumer science, neuromarketing. I mean, that is the present day challenges that people are going to have to try to tackle. But very interesting. We'll be sure to include a link to your book in the show notes and everything, but I do want to leave a little time for us to play the fun React Attack game. I have 10 words ready for you to go. And basically, for anyone that's a new listener here, I'm just going to say a word and Michael is going to just say the first thing that pops into his head. Can't get anything wrong, but we're going to get a little idea of what his associations are with these words.
Can I Google the words before we start?
As fast as you can. Are you ready, Michael, to get started?
No, but let's go anyway.
Okay, so the first, I should say phrase, product placement.
The future.
Habits.
Tough to break.
Consulting.
Engaging.
Writing.
Difficult.
Engagement.
Flow.
Consumption.
Too much.
Memory.
The past.
Ads.
Entertaining yet tedious.
Social norms.
Critically important to understand.
Change.
Good.
And then the last word, TikTok.
Never signed on.
Me either.
I gotta ask, when for engagement, having flow come up, do you mean the psychological idea of flow, concept of flow?
Yes, I do. So imagine you're watching a really intriguing movie and you just get lost in it. It's pretty much like the psychological state of flow. And we strive for that in any kind of creative medium, but seldom realize it. But if we could, that would be what I would think of as engagement.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. So we want to thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. If people are interested in either reading your book, reaching out to you, where can they find you? Where can they contact you?
Finding me in terms of social media, LinkedIn, probably, because I don't use much other. They can always email me, michael@adaptationresearch.com. And you said you'd put a link to the book in there. So
absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. And until next time, we look forward to chatting again.
A real pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter @HCD Research Inc. and @HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you and stay tuned for more curious conversations.